I'm sure you already heard of Tetris, but in case you haven't, back in the 90s, this game was taking over the world. People were playing it so much that some of them were seeing falling blocks even when they weren't in the game. This phenomenon became so common that psychologists actually named it after the title itself, the Tetris effect. Now, what you might not know though is the absolute chaos behind getting this game published in the first place. A hodgepodge of companies, messy licensing deals, and even negotiations with the Soviet government. This is the story of Tetris. We begin in Moscow 1984, at the Computer Center for the Soviet Academy of Science. This was quite the prestigious place, well renowned for its research across a variety of fields. Some notable achievements include supporting the launch of the first artificial Earth satellite and providing research for the development of the atomic and hydrogen bombs. But unlike the scientists who came before him, Alexey Pajitnov found himself working on something a little different. In his free time, he was trying to make a game. Now, to understand what kind of game he was making, you have to know one thing about Alexey. The man loved his puzzles, with one of his favorites being one called pentomnos. These came with 12 unique shapes and a rectangular box, with the goal being to put all the pieces in. Alexey imagined these pentomnos falling from the sky and being collected in a glass, with the player being able to manipulate them as they fell. Turning this idea into code, he decided to name it Tetris, a combination of the word tetra for the 4 blocks that make up each piece, and tennis? Guess he just really liked it. Once the game was finished, Alexey copied it into a floppy disk and shared it with a few colleagues, just to get an idea of what they thought. What happened next was beyond what Alexey would have ever expected. Within just 2 weeks, Tetris had spread across Moscow's computer labs. One thing led to another, and eventually the game had somehow made its way over to Hungary, to a tech fair at their Institute of Technology. Also present in the institute at the time was Robert Stein from Andromeda Software. Stein was a salesman who specialized in licensing and distributing games between Hungary and the West. So as you'd expect, he was there to browse, looking for the next big title to sell. And as luck would have it, Tetris caught his eye. After a few rounds, Stein was hooked. So after learning about the game's origin, he sent a proposal via telex to Alexey's computer center in Moscow. He wanted to publish this game. Now, something you should know about this computer center is that sending a message back was far more complicated than you think. First, Alexey had to write his response in Russian, then it needed to be approved, after which it would be translated, and only then could it finally be sent. What this meant was that even though Alexey's original reply looked something like this, what Stein thought that he got was a legally binding deal. And with that misunderstanding in hand, Stein figured he was now free to sell the rights to Tetris to the rest of the world. His first client? Microsoft, a firm owned in part by newspaper mogul Robert Maxwell. The clientele also extended to Spectrum Holobyte, another one of his companies. Now, even though Stein believed he had the rights to do this, an agreement between him and Alexey was yet to be signed. And to make things even harder, back in Moscow, a government agency had caught wind of what was happening. Remember, the Soviet Union was a communist nation, so it was illegal for an individual to personally make money by selling their IP. Every creation belonged to the state. So enter
Электронна оргтехника.
or ELOG for short. This was the agency tasked with overseeing the import and export of the hardware and software. So naturally, they were stepping in to deal with this matter. These were tough negotiations, and they lasted for over a year. And all the while this took place, Tetris was still being sold. In the UK, Microsoft released the game and quickly found itself sitting on one of the best-selling titles in the country. Across the Atlantic, Spectrum Holobyte did the same in the United States. By any reasonable definition, the game was a global hit. In May of 1988, ELOG and Robert Stein finally agreed to an official contract. The terms were simple. Stein had the rights to Tetris on computers. Note the emphasis I'm putting on computers? That's because it's gonna matter later. Either ways, since Tetris was selling millions of copies, Stein was already thinking ahead and talking ahead. He assured Microsoft that the arcade rights were coming soon. No paperwork yet, but soon. The problem was that no such deal existed. Still, with Stein's assurances in hand, Microsoft moved quickly. They sold the arcade rights for Tetris in the US to Atari and to Sega in Japan. From their perspective, everything made sense. Stein had the game, Stein was the middleman. Stein said that the rights were coming, even though they weren't. Okay, this is a good time to pause for a bit, because while all this is happening, another key character was about to enter the story. Henk Rogers. In 1988, Rogers was based in Japan. He was the founder of a small game company called Bulletproof Software and had flown to Vegas to attend the Consumer Electronics Show, CES for short. This was the big one. New hardware, new software, flashy builds, loud music, bright lights. If a game was meant to succeed this year, it was probably over here. And somewhere in the middle of all that noise, Henk stumbled onto something very quiet. Tetris. At first glance, it didn't look like much. No fancy graphics, no storyline, no characters, just folding shapes. But Henk, he couldn't stop playing. He got back in line, and then again, and then again. 4 times in total. While everyone else was busy chasing the next visually impressive game, Henk was standing there thinking the unthinkable. This might be perfect. No filler, no nonsense, just a pure puzzle. So he got his hands on 2 versions, Spectrum Holobyte's IBM PC release and Microsoft's Commodore 64 version, and then handed them to his quality assurance team. They passed with flying colors. Soon, everyone at Bulletproof Software wanted to play, and Henk, watching this happen, reached a simple conclusion. Japan was going to love this game. So Henk got to work soon. He already had connections to Nintendo. His plan was to secure the Tetris license for his company BPS and then produce it for the Nintendo's Famicom. Microsoft's name was on the copyright notice, so he faxed them first, and then faxed again and again. Eventually, he received a reply. This fax no longer belongs to Microsoft. Wrong door. Several months later, he finally reached the right one, and he was told that Spectrum Holobyte CEO Gilman Louis would be visiting Japan in June of 1988 to license the rights to Tetris. He got in touch, and soon after, they were in Henk's office in Yokohama. He and Gilman had just signed a letter of intent. Not a full contract, but close enough to celebrate. Henk had just licensed all the rights Gilman had to Tetris in Japan. Personal computers, consoles, arcades. Or more accurately, all the rights Gilman thought he had. 3 weeks later, he called back. It turned out that the rights that Henk was after had already been traded to Atari. What for, you ask? This was unfortunate. Christmas was approaching, and over half of annual game sales happened during that window. Missing it meant missing everything. So Henk's next move was to buy a plane ticket. 1 week later, he found himself sitting at opposite ends of a very long table at Atari Games. Across from him sat Atari Games president Hideyuki Nakajima. After a brief discussion, another meeting was held in a sushi bar the following week. It was there that the deal was finally made. Henk finally had the rights. Work began fast. They reprogrammed Tetris to work with the Famicom controller, added some Russian folk songs as the music, and added some new rules that Henk thought would make the game more exciting. Players could now get bonus points for clearing multiple lines. He called those achievements a double for 2, triple for 3, and a Tetris for 4.
You don't need a Tetris shop.
Against all odds, the game was ready before Christmas, and by January next year, all their efforts would be paid off. Retailers couldn't keep copies of the game on their shelves. Stores were running out of stock. Tetris was going viral, so much so that all stores over Japan were clamoring for the game. Now might be a good time to look at how publishing a game with Nintendo worked in Japan. First, you sent your salespeople to visit distributors from all over the country. Through this, you got your orders for the game. Depending on the amount of orders, you'd pay Nintendo to initiate manufacturing for the cartridges. Once they arrived at the distributors 2 months later, you finally got paid. For December, Tetris had only managed to get around 70,000 orders. This time, however, they got over double that, 200k. And while that may seem like a good thing, which for the most part it was, it also came with a cost. With cartridges going for $10 a piece, you would have to come up with $2 million to meet this demand. Now for a company who had just sold out their stock only a month ago, the loan might seem pretty easy to get. It was not. Henk was a foreigner. No bank in Japan would loan that much to a foreigner. At least not without collateral. That came with another problem though. Rogers didn't even own the car he drove, he leased it. How was he ever gonna come up with the collateral amounting to that much? At a final desperate attempt, he turned to his wife. Would her parents be willing to put up their property as collateral? To his surprise, they agreed. He had their support. With the money now raised and Nintendo now paid, all he had to do was wait. 2 months and he'd get all the money back, with a massive profit to show for it. In other news, around this time, something big was happening over at the headquarters of Nintendo. The company was planning on releasing their first ever portable game console, the Game Boy. When Rogers first heard about this, he had an idea. He contacted the people in charge and pitched including Tetris as a packing game for the new machine. If you want little boys to buy your game, include Mario. But if you want everyone to buy the Game Boy, include Tetris. The pitch worked. Tetris was set to be included as a pack-in. The only thing left to do now was secure the worldwide handheld rights. This brings us back to where we left off. Henk knew that none of the other companies, Mirrorsoft or Spectrum Holobyte, had secured the rights to this yet. So his best bet was to cut out the middlemen and contact the person closest to the Russians, Andromeda Software, or more accurately, Robert Stein. Stein, with already a lot on his plate, kept postponing, and eventually, Rogers lost his patience. It was time to take matters into his own hands. Henk Rogers was heading to Moscow. But Rogers wasn't the only one heading there. Robert Stein was also on his way there. At this point, he already had a lot to worry about. He'd already been talking to multiple other parties about the handheld rights, even though he didn't actually have them yet. On top of that, the situation in Moscow had changed. The ELOG representative he'd been dealing with was replaced, and the contracts he had didn't fully cover everything he'd already sublicensed. If ELOG decided to look closely, a lot of this could unravel very quickly. So Stein's goal in Moscow was simple: protect what he had and try to secure the rights he'd already sold off as if he owned them. And then there was a third person, Kevin Maxwell, the CEO of Mirrorsoft, or maybe more importantly, Robert Maxwell's son. Mirrorsoft had started to realize that the handheld rights weren't locked down at all. And considering how valuable Tetris was becoming, they weren't going to just sit back and hope things worked out. So Maxwell decided to go straight to ELOG himself to see if Mirrorsoft could secure those rights before someone else did. To make the situation even more exciting, they would all have their meetings with the Russians on the exact same day as well, just hours apart from each other. Back at ELOG, the one who had replaced Tetris' previous representative was Belikov. Belikov was sharp, and he wanted the best for his country. He was going to make sure that the negotiations were well fought. His first meeting was with Rogers. Rogers didn't even know where ELOG was, and his meeting wasn't planned beforehand. He simply showed up to Moscow and made his way to the agency. And although it normally wasn't allowed to go into a government building without prior permissions, they decided to make an exception. Why? Not really sure. But either ways, Henk decided that his best bet to obtain the handheld rights was to share how successful Tetris has been overseas. He had brought along a Famicom cartridge of the game to show as evidence of his prior efforts. His response was not one that Henk had expected. "We never licensed Tetris for consoles to anyone." This was trouble. Henk's world started moving in slow motion. If what Belikov was saying was true, everything that he had done up to this point had been worthless. His business, the money that he borrowed from the bank, the property that his in-laws had put up, everything was in jeopardy. Focus. He could think about all of this later. He quickly changed topics. "We will figure out what happened with the console rights later. I'm here because I'm interested in the handheld rights." Belikov surprisingly agreed, and so their actual meeting was set for the following day. This time around, the discussions were going pretty well. And after a while, once Rogers had gained his trust, Belikov had a request. He wanted Rogers to take a look at the contract that his predecessor had entered with Robert Stein. And from what Henk saw, the wording was pretty unclear. Stein had written up the contract for the rights to Tetris for the computer. And so while the Russians believed that this meant a personal computer, Robert and Mirrorsoft thought that this was applicable to any computer, which could contain a number of platforms, including consoles. Through this confusion, while the Russians thought that they had just given the personal computer rights to Andromeda Software, here's what actually happened. Andromeda had given the rights to Mirrorsoft, and then them thinking that they had the worldwide computer rights, had licensed the PC rights to Spectrum Holobyte and the console rights to Atari Games. In addition, Spectrum Holobyte then licensed personal computer rights to Bulletproof Software for the Japanese market, and Atari Games then licensed Japanese Nintendo Famicom rights to the same company. If you're confused right now, don't worry, they were too. After learning about all this, Belikov had to act quick. His meeting with Stein was later in the day, and he knew that Stein was coming to get a more secure contract in place. So in between meetings, Belikov quickly reverted the contract. He made sure to specify that the rights that he was signing over were only for the personal computer. But that meeting had to wait, because up next, he would be dealing with Kevin Maxwell. Belikov opened by showing him the cartridge that Rogers had left. He explained the situation and asked him why Mirrorsoft's name was on the packaging. Caught off guard, Maxwell simply called it a bootleg and left before he could be further scrutinized. That was surprisingly easy. No time for celebrations though. He had Stein up next. Would he realize that the contract had changed? Would he try and call Belikov out? Never mind. It turns out that Stein was far too occupied with just retaining his rights, and in doing so he completely overlooked the fact that the wording had changed. Stein left Russia without the handheld or the console rights. Contractually, and by the admission of the Microsoft CEO, it was finally settled. All versions of Tetris that weren't on a personal computer were now deemed illegal. Everything was back on the table to play for. At this point of time, however, there was only one player left. Rogers was the only one still in Russia. As his meetings with Belikov grew more serious, the amount of people sitting across the table grew as well. There were around 8 others in the room with him now, and there was one in particular that stood out. The man I'm referring to right now is none other than Alexey Pajitnov. So now, having made a new friend, and therefore having secured Alexey's support during the meetings, with the addition of Belikov seeing the potential in the deal as well, at last, Rogers had won the hand. He had finally secured the rights to handheld Tetris. He could return home victorious. But wait, aren't we forgetting something? His in-laws' properties. They haven't been secured yet. He still needed the console rights for that to work out. This, however, wasn't going to be as simple as it was before. He wasn't the only one on the table anymore. Maxwell had realized what they had lost, and they wanted their rights back. Unbeknownst to everyone else at the time, Microsoft was also on his last legs. Robert Maxwell was drowning in debt, and all his businesses were at risk of going under. But all wasn't lost yet. They already had a deal with Atari Games for console rights, so all he needed was to secure them from the Russians and he'd be good again. This was as much of a do or die for him as it was for Rogers. The battle as it was, however, didn't quite seem fair. Rogers was pretty successful, don't get me wrong, but he didn't have anywhere near the amount of resources that Robert Maxwell did. How was he ever going to make a deal to compete with Microsoft? Well, that's where Nintendo comes in, because while Rogers and Maxwell were battling over contracts in Moscow, another war was already underway. Back in the US, Nintendo and Atari were locked in a legal standoff. Atari Games was preparing to do something Nintendo spent years preventing, releasing NES-compatible cartridges that Nintendo didn't manufacture themselves, and the game they planned to use it to break the system wide open was Tetris. Nintendo's entire business depended on control. Control over cartridges, control over publishers, control over what could and couldn't run on their hardware. If Atari succeeded, that control would disappear overnight. They could fight Atari over how they manufactured this, reverse engineering, patents and trademarks, but those cases would take years that Atari didn't need. What Nintendo needed was something faster. They needed a silver bullet. They needed the console rights to Tetris. Because if Nintendo could prove in court that Atari never had the rights to publish Tetris on consoles in the first place, everything else becomes irrelevant. While Rogers returned to Moscow to sit in meetings with Belikov, fighting for the console rights, Robert Maxwell was doing something very different. Maxwell wasn't just a publisher trying to protect the shaky licensing deal. He was the figure with deep political connections. As the owner of one of Britain's largest media empires, a former member of the parliament, and someone who counted world leaders among his acquaintances, Maxwell had real access at the highest levels, and he believed that he could use that to determine how the negotiations would go. Throughout March 1989, as Rogers continued pressing ELOG, Kevin Maxwell, Robert's son and Microsoft CEO, began sending increasingly aggressive communications to Belikov. These weren't just polite reminders about contracts, they were threats, attempting to leverage political pressure on ELOG to obtain the console rights for his company. Maxwell hinted at his father's connections and the influence that might be brought to bear if necessary. And this put Belikov in a difficult spot. He wasn't just dealing with a publisher anymore, he was dealing with British political power, someone who could, theoretically, make complaints all the way up to Gorbachev's office. But what the Maxwells hadn't expected was that the Soviet Union in 1989 was in the midst of a change. What mattered most now wasn't the whims of a foreign media baron, it was what was best for the country, and as a result, Gorbachev refused to intervene in the Tetris licensing battle. It just wasn't in the nation's best interest. As the discussions pressed on, Nintendo and Rogers were working from a position of clarity and clean paperwork. offering E-Log not just money but certainty, something that Stein and Microsoft's chain of sub-licenses couldn't match. Rogers and Nintendo eventually agreed to the terms that E-Log found far more straightforward: solid financial guarantees. And as soon as they had won out in the negotiations, Nintendo headed straight for court. They served Atari Games for the cease and desist, and the judge agreed. Just like that, the case was over and Nintendo had won. And the payoff? It was historic. Nintendo's Game Boy, launched with Tetris included as a pack-in title, became one of the biggest selling handheld systems of all time. Nintendo's NES version of Tetris went on to sell millions of copies as well. And the game itself? Well, the records speak for themselves. As for Henk Rogers, all that risk, all those late night flights and all that borrowed money had finally paid off. Not only did he secure the rights and ensure Tetris reached the world, but he also cemented his place in gaming history. Now, with all of these stories wrapping up, it seems like we are overlooking something. You guys still remember Alexey, the guy who actually created the game to begin with, right? Alexey Pajitnov didn't get rich when Tetris became a worldwide hit. He didn't earn a single dollar because he developed Tetris while working for a Soviet government institute. The rights legally belonged to the state, and E-Log controlled all licensing and revenue. Even as millions of people played his game, Alexey saw nothing from those sales. And when Henk offered to pay him out of his own pocket, Alexey wouldn't agree. He couldn't. It would have been illegal and he didn't want any trouble. What Rogers did do was help him and his family move to the US in 1991. Living and working in the US gave him opportunities that would have been impossible as a Soviet state employee. For years after moving, Alexey still didn't profit from Tetris. The original E-Log licensing agreements continued to control the rights, and he wasn't entitled to royalties just because he had created the game. That, however, changed in the mid-90s. After the Soviet Union had collapsed and the old contracts had expired, the rights to Tetris reverted back to Alexey. And so this gave him legal ownership of his own creation for the very first time. In 1996, Alexey went back to his old friend, and what they founded was the Tetris Company, a firm to manage the rights and licensing for Tetris for all future versions. Henk's decades of licensing deals and partnerships, especially with Nintendo, made him wealthy in the process, and Alexey finally received both recognition and compensation worthy of the creator of one of the most iconic games ever made. And with that, the story of the most popular game in the world finally comes to a satisfying end.